So it's really, I call this my digital ID journey in many ways. It's centered around bring your own identity, and how pretty early on I became a skeptic of this whole social login and single sign-on aspect from a personal privacy perspective. So these are the views and opinions of myself personally, nothing to do with my employer or past employers even. But here we go. How did this all start? Well, back some time ago when I was at Burton Group working in the identity and privacy practice, I came across this article from Citrix. And it really hit me. It really resounded with me. It was about bringing your own computer. So if you think back, and maybe some of this still happens, where you work at a corporation, we buy 10,000, 20,000 PCs, everyone gets the same laptop. I don't care what you do or who you are, we're just gonna get 10,000 or 20,000 Compaqs or HPs or Dells or what have you, and we'll just distribute them. But Citrix came up with the idea, well, maybe I'll give you an allowance of a certain amount of money, and you can configure your own kind of computer. If you do graphics, and maybe I want a certain graphics card at the time, a certain amount of memory, disk space, and so on. So the idea was, well, I can personalize this and essentially sort of bring my own, not my own personal computer from home, but configure my own computer. So great, I wrote a blog post about it around that time, bring your own identity. I had to go back to the Wayback Machine to find this. I didn't have a copy of it myself, so it was pretty cool to be able to find it. So yeah, I talked about it. Well, if I can bring my own computer, why can't I bring my own identity? I have to register and verify with so many different properties, even at that period of time. And we'll talk more about this. Can I register or reuse a single credential or identity verification process and use that in multiple places? It sounded like that made a lot of sense to me. And you can see over in the tag cloud on the right here some of the other topics we were talking about at the time. One that stands out to me is this thing called limited liability persona, maybe even an antecedent to things like self-sovereign identity these days. It was I think you can still find some of the articles. It was the notion that you could incorporate, like an LLC, you can incorporate some aspect of your identity and have the protections of a corporation assigned to you personally. So that's the basis of that. And then Bob Blakely was also writing about identity oracles at the time, did a session at our conference where it was about the very limited release of information. So we've been talking about these concepts for a long, long time. It's interesting to see that in the keynotes today we talked about it as well. And if you think about social login today, well, it's really pretty ubiquitous, right? Log in with Facebook, log in with Google, with LinkedIn. And so this is all around us, the convenience is there. And I think that's really what's happening, right, is the convenience of all this is so very appealing to us. But then, there's always the negative aspects. So you can sort of see, well, I am a skeptic. I didn't buy into this. I've got 300 and some IDs or logins and counting, and my password's safe. So obviously I didn't jump into this, even though I was one of these sort of advocates very early on in the discussion, because it did make so much sense. There's so much inefficiency in the whole process of accessing any kind of relying party website. Everyone seemed to be in a command and control kind of stance where I have to manage the credential, otherwise you can't have access to my service or my resources. And of course, the registration process today remains incredibly painful. It's one of those negative user experiences that Andre talked about this morning, for example. And then when you look at how we operate today, cloud-based model, very distributed, microservice, API-driven, well, this social login aspect seems to make sense, right? Now we have OAuth and OpenID Connect tokens to pass around, so it's technically a lot easier to do this. So this way, these relying parties, the service providers, you can focus on managing access, not managing all these credentials. Fantastic, great. Oh, maybe not so much. Then privacy meets modern technology. Back in 2007, 8 or so, Smartphones were just really emerging. And then, of course, the ubiquitous, or the continuous connectivity, not ubiquitous, but continuous connectivity. And then, of course, all of the apps. And another aspect this points out is there's multiple layers involved. Marlo was just talking about, from an organization's perspective, about data minimization and how you manage that, catalog it, and so on. But it's not just you, the relying party or service provider. It's the device manufacturer. It's the network carrier. It's the apps that are running. Everyone has some different piece of data about you, so it's not even a single entity that we have to or are able to manage. And of course, privacy meets big tech. I have a number of references to articles as I proceed here, and most of these have been negatively covered in recent times, especially over the last, say, couple of years. Mostly in a negative way, and some in a more positive way, like Microsoft and Apple recently, for example. But big tech is also the center of the economic universe these days, also as highlighted by Andre this morning. So they have an immense amount of power economically, and of course with the data that they have. So originally, I didn't really think about all these sort of negative side effects. If I'm concentrating onto a few number of identities or credentials, well, you're also making it easier for these organizations to track you, whether it's commercial or government oriented. It's easier now for them to correlate even the metadata that's out there about us. And of course, the privacy or the data controls are, they're non-existent, they're very weak, or they're always incredibly confusing. So anything we can do to improve that is going to be a benefit. And then, of course, the lack of transparency. We don't know how deep or how big this hole is in the ground of how much data is collected about us. More and more of that is being revealed over time, as we'll see in some of the article mentions I make, but we really still don't know the extent to the data that's collected and out there about us. And it's becoming a big surveillance issue. And here, let's pause and take just a slight tangent, because up until now, this feeling or this cycle I've been going through was eerily reminiscent to a keynote I heard Sherry Turkle give at a Gartner conference a few years ago. So she is a cultural analyst, a psychologist, and back in the mid-90s, she embarked on a study of the impact of technology on people at that period of time. Very early on, mostly focusing on people's use of email and text. And similar to my initial reaction, she thought this was a wonderful thing that was going to enable so much more interaction, different kinds of interaction between people. And then she went back some number of years later and did a redo of the study, talking to a lot of the same people, interviewing a lot of the same people that she had spoken to previously. And she completely reversed her opinion. This TED Talk here goes through that. Her book, Alone Together, also goes through some of this experience. It's really, really enlightening, and it's really solidified my thoughts around this. So I definitely highly recommend it. So maybe I'm a little bit paranoid. Of course, it's not paranoia if they're really watching you. And even this morning, I had to update the slides because this article came out in the journal about how the NSA, again, is improperly collecting phone records. They use some very gentle description of this. I wrote it down because I can never remember it, and it's not reasonable. They say it's an over-collection episode. Sounds kind of benign to me, no big deal. But I mostly focus on the surveillance capitalism, or the corporate side of things. Although obviously there's lots of issues on the government side. But for today's talk, I focus more on the commercial side of things. And this certainly resonates with me, surveillance capitalism, the new genus of capitalism that monetizes data acquired through surveillance. The surveillance has a really negative connotation, but really that's, when you think about it, that's what's happening out there. And this also reminds me to follow the money. That always explains a lot when you follow the money. And it also brings to mind some of the recent talks and presentations and so on that you hear from auto manufacturers these days. If you have heard about the $0 car, it's really fascinating. It shows on the first hand how the automotive industry is completely turning inside out. But it also, and part of that is it shows you where the real value is. It's not in selling vehicles. It's not in selling a $50,000 car. It's in all of the data that's now being generated by the hundreds of sensors in a typical vehicle. There's more value in monetizing that data than in selling you the vehicle. It's really remarkable. But again, it tells you about how our world is changing. So also, I don't talk about things like data breaches or even criminal activity. I'm talking about the normal operating procedure, the normal standard operating procedure of a typical organization. And I have just a few examples here. There's so many of them almost every day of the week, like I mentioned earlier, that we can point to. And one convenient one is Alexa. And now, if you were here a couple years ago in New Orleans for Identiverse, Alan Foster talked about how Alexa hacked his house. It's a really amusing session, fairly harmless. But then things like the first one you hear happens where Alexa is listening when you don't think she's listening, and a personal conversation is captured and automatically texted, the recording of it, to someone in your contact list. It really can be potentially embarrassing. More recently, they've been found to be recording children. And that's also certainly concerning, but no big deal. There's only 100 million of these out there, and that's just Alexa. Doesn't include the other digital assistants. So very, very concerning. Oh, how about your email? Is that private? Well, I guess not. You do get those reminders or those suggestions. I did buy those boots. Maybe you want some overcoat to go with that. Well, it borders somewhere between convenient and interesting to really creepy. So that's definitely an uncomfortable situation to be in. And then, like I said before, there's lots of different layers in this privacy discussion. It's not just your phone, the network carrier, but also the apps. Apps are collecting data. Well, are they sharing it or selling it? There's really a lack of transparency here of what's going on. So that's the sort of stuff that goes around in my head. So are things improving, getting worse, staying the same? Well, I think there's some positive signs out there. So Verizon and AT&T said they're going to stop selling your data. Great, that's progress. But what about everybody else? What about T-Mobile and Sprint and so on? And can we really trust them? They've definitely not been trustworthy about this. And then Google says, well, the FBI wants to collect location data for a suspected criminal. And they say, no, we're not going to give you that. Great. But why does Google have this data, or why is Google storing this data to begin with? That's a bigger issue, I think. Here's another idea. Well, if the carriers can sell your data, why should the cops get a warrant? Why can't they just buy the data? Seems like an easier process to me. And it shows you another, what's the right angle here to think about. And then regulations were a topic this morning at the keynote as well. Is regulation the answer? Is GDPR and similar the answer? I don't know. Certainly it's a good possibility, but I certainly don't want to necessarily take the advice of big tech. This is absolutely an example of the fox telling us how the hen house should be guarded. So not so much, thank you. But blockchain, there's another trigger point for Steve. Sorry, Steve. But this seems like some progress. The new Apple login. Certainly the idea here is a limited release of data. That's all goodness as far as I'm concerned. I'm down with that. But it's relatively new. Let's see how it proves out in the end here after we get a little more experience with it. What about things like self-sovereign identity? It seems like it's a very active group right now, very much pushing the envelope here to try to give us back control of our data. I don't know how this is going to work out. What about user-managed access? Another great effort to put the focus on putting us back in control of our data. How's that going to work out? I don't know. And that's probably the biggest answer I have, or the most common answer I have. I don't know how this is going to turn out. Marla was just talking about all these privacy regulations. I think one of the biggest things they do for us is to raise awareness and to raise the range of possibilities of giving us more control and visibility to what's happening with our data. And there's obviously a lot of heat on big tech. And this is where I said earlier, we don't know how big or how deep this hole is of how much data is out there about us. But as we get more coverage and more awareness, that's a big positive factor, I think. And what else can we do? Well, what I'm trying to do so far is keep my identifiers and my credentials separate, one from the other. I probably have limited impact on this, but at least I feel better about what I'm doing. There's probably tons of metadata that's still be able to correlate my activities and my travels on the internet. You can log off the big tech folks. I know some in the audience have done that, getting off of Facebook. In some cases, there are alternatives. What's the real alternative to Facebook? That's you don't really have options there. Maybe there's some alternatives for search engines, for example, but they have, no one has the reach that Google does, for example. And do we have other ideas? I don't know. There's other possibilities, but yeah, I think there's some small minority of people that are trying to, find a different way forward. And where do we go from here? I really, honestly don't know. It's going to be really interesting. Hopefully it will improve for the better, but I think we're going to do a lot of sideways tracking, make a few steps forward, a few steps back. We're really going to be in an undetermined situation, I think, here for some period of time. But I think the biggest thing is awareness. And I'm a big Lucinda Williams fan, and I love this quote. It really comes down to, all I ask is, don't tell anybody the secrets that I tell you. Is that too much to ask for? I hope not. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.